Visualize living in a country with some of the most beautiful waters on the planet and the cleanest air you could imagine. A country blessed with a plethora of renewable resources, able to build and sustain nations. The Bahamas is an archipelago located on the northwestern edge of the West Indies. With a population of less than 400,000 and a multitude of renewable resources, the Bahamas is most certainly a global player in its capacity to enrich and contribute to economies all over the world. The most dominant sector of them all is marine resources, most definitely because the marine environment in the Bahamas constitutes to 85% of the archipelago. From the expansive flats to the mangrove nursery systems, each component of our marine environment works hand in hand to populate the world's oceans. There are 4 types of mangroves in the Bahamas. We have the red mangroves, black mangroves, white mangroves, and buttonwood mangroves.
So here we are standing in front of the red mangroves. Now what's significant about these particular mangroves is they serve as the primary nursery system for a lot of our marine resources. So that includes fish, lobster, just to name a few. And what is meant by marine nursery system is, it is within these roots of the red mangroves where these fish and other marine resources are spawned. So you can understand the significance of protecting these mangroves.
Mangroves play a critical role in replenishing most of the ocean's fish stock. Second to our mangrove nursery system is the tidal flats of the Bahamas. The Bahamas has the largest tidal flats of its kind in the entire Western Hemisphere. These flats are a haven for shrimp, crab, and lemon sharks, and it is also home to the largest population of bonefish in the world. The tidal flats in the Bahamas welcome fly fishermen from all over the world to fish for bonefish, tarpon, or permit. With these conditions, along with 340 plus days of sun and some of the clearest waters on the planet, the Bahamas is an ideal world-class sanctuary for fly fishermen from across the globe. Another essential component of our marine environment is coral reefs. Coral reefs provide protection and shelter for many different species of fish and marine life. The Bahamas has the largest concentration of coral reefs in the Caribbean. The Andros Barrier Reef is the 3rd largest fringing barrier reef and the 3rd largest living organism in the world. Another unique feature of the Bahamas' topography is blue holes. Blue holes are large marine sinkholes that form at the surface of carbonate bedrock, which makes complete sense because the Bahamian Islands are made of pure calcium carbonate. The Bahamas has the largest concentration of blue holes in the world, and Bahamian blue holes are the only tidal freshwater blue holes found on Earth. They can be found both inland and offshore. Andros Island, the largest in the archipelago, has more than 220 named blue holes, and they are mostly unexplored. Andros is home to gaping portals to ancient worlds. These mysterious underwater cave systems are a diver's mecca. With the tongue of the ocean running straight through its islands, as well as its strategic location, the Bahamas is resourcefully and academically equipped to carry out the mandate of a successful maritime industry. There are 2 components that make the Bahamas richer than any other country in the Caribbean. The first is the tongue of the ocean. The tongue of the ocean, is a deep water trench that can be as deep as 6,000 feet at its deepest and starts at about 70 feet at its shallowest. It acts as a perfect place for deep sea exploration because of its drastic deep water relatively close to land. The second unique feature of the Bahamas' topography is its shipping lanes. The Bahamas' archipelago has 3 significant shipping lanes that contribute to global economics and trade around the world. We have the Northeast Providence Channel, the Northwest Providence Channel, and the Mayaguana and Crooked Island Passage. As far as mineral resources, the Bahamas can definitely be considered a gold mine. The Bahamas has the purest calcium carbonate in the world. Here, it can be found in the form of limestone and sand. Calcium carbonate is a mineral which is used in every area of life. It can be found in items used worldwide like cement, paint, paper, plastics, glass, and steel, just to name a few. It is also an essential ingredient in the food production industry. It can be found in items like calcium supplements, antacids, baking powder, toothpaste, and even wine. Though these mineral resources have extensive monetary value, this material serves a much greater purpose in its natural environment and will only benefit Bahamians if extracted sustainably. If aragonite mining is done sustainably, it can inject an excess of $1 billion into the Bahamian economy, not to mention ensuring that crucial ecosystems like the Jolter Keys in North Andros are not wiped out through excessive accumulation of sand. For 13 islands of the Bahamas, a layer of fresh water lies just beneath the surface of the limestone. It is this freshwater lens that sustains the thousands of miles of pine forests and coppice forests that you'd find on almost every island. Andros Island has the largest freshwater lens in the Bahamas. This lens supports hundreds of commercial farmers on the island who farm produce like tomatoes, cucumbers, bird peppers, and watermelons. You can imagine what these lens of fresh water must mean for the potential impact the Bahamas can make on food security globally. And that, my friends, is just the tip of the iceberg. Considering the facts, it's easy to see how the Bahamas is most certainly wealthier than Saudi Arabia or Dubai when it comes to natural resources. All of the Bahamas' resources, whether it be air, land, or sea, are interconnected and interdependent. Each component relies on the other for survival, which is why we must place a concentrated focus on sustainable development, resource management, and ecosystem protection and recovery.
And good evening, everyone. To all of you, welcome, welcome, welcome. The Bahamas Natural Resources Foundation is so very excited to have each and every one of you partner with us this evening as we continue our Critical Conversations series. We thank you for carving out some time for us to really get into these conversations. It is season 1. And we are excited at where we have come from thus far. But before we go any further, I do want to pause a couple of things. Firstly, that link that you got inviting you on this, share it with someone. Go ahead right now. Take a minute that you can share with someone, send the link out, let someone know, hey, we are about to have some really serious conversations and we would like for you to be a part of it. So get the link, share it out with someone, send it out to your network, send it out to your friends, send it out to your chats, and invite them into the conversation this evening. It really promises to be engaging. And the more persons that we have connecting, the more persons we have participating, the momentum builds. And so we really would like for you to share. Invite them on our Facebook page at BNRF Bahamas. Invite them with the link to join in via Zoom. Just invite. Alrighty, so I'm hearing that I'm getting a note that you can't hear me. Please give me a thumbs up if you're still not hearing me. Just want to make sure everyone is able to connect with me. Just give me a thumbs up. Let me know if you are hearing me. Alrighty, awesome. I'm hearing that some persons are, please keep me posted, keep me centered. I do want us to pause for a minute. Father, we thank you. We thank you for the gathering. We thank you for the opportunity to have this discussion about the richness and the resources that you have given us in this part of the earth that you've carved out called the Bahamas. We just give you praise and honor for who you are, for your grace and your mercy towards us. We thank you for this connection, this engagement this evening. We ask you to just send your Holy Spirit, just to tabernacle over us and expand our understanding as we share this evening. And when we walk away, Father, let there be a call to action so that we won't just be hearers, we'll actually become participants in our own evolution, our own liberation as a people. We thank you. We bless you in the name of Yeshua. Amen. 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 And so we want to start in the chat by letting us know who's on. Let us know what island you're from. As we get right into our conversation, we have a lot to cover this evening. And as we do that, just type in the chat. Let us know where you're watching us from. Let us know what island you're on. I'm in Grand Bahama. A lot of people are in Nassau. So just connect with us and let us know where you're representing from. So we want to give a little recap on where we are. The Bahamas Natural Resources Foundation thought that it was vitally important to sponsor this series and critical conversations to start to bring about a mind shift, a transformation of our own mindset as it relates to our environment. For too long, a lot of us have equated wealth with certain types of jobs, certain perspectives, and our attitude and approach towards where we are. Thank you. The chat is lighting up. Central Andres is in the house. Grand Bahama is watching. Nassau is definitely represented. Ellen from Hope Town, Abaco. Nice to have you, Ms. Hardy. We love that you're on board. And a lot of our families, our parents, our grandparents, they knew the humble beginnings that they had, and a lot of hardship was connected to that. And so we did a pendulum swing and we focused a lot of attention on white collar jobs and what we call professional jobs. There was nothing wrong with that, except that there wasn't a balance. And because we didn't have this balance, we went from one pendulum to the other. And that came at the expense of our environment. And so now we have a lot of Bahamians, if you are not connected with someone who has folklore history, who can tell you about the grounds or about the bush or about the greenery, about what's happening in the ocean. Many of us don't know. And because of our ignorance, we may be missing out on the actual space that represents wealth for us as a nation. And so in order for us to embrace, to pivot, because when we look at the economic environment that we're currently in, there has to be a pivot. Otherwise, the crisis that we are facing is actually escalating. But we actually have a way to get out. And we won't know unless we get info, unless there is knowledge, unless there's an expansion and an appreciation of where we are as a people. What do we have? What's in your hand and how can we use? And so in September, we started the conversations with Dr. Ancelino Davis. And we were talking about the groundwater monitoring and sustainable management in the Bahamas, not understanding the impact of just dredging and the impact of the hurricanes and the impact of some of these canals and things that we're building in our environment, and what it's actually doing to our water tables and what it's doing to our ecosystems. And so we were framed to look at it from one perspective without having a healthy respect for the environment in another. And so that was a very enlightening conversation that we had in September. Then in October, Dr. Delaveau came and he talked to us about the importance of the mangrove forest and the diverse ecosystems that exist. We learned that these systems are so alive. And because of our ignorance, and a lot of times this ignorance has led to the death, to the detriment of these environments. And because we didn't connect the dots, they may have contributed to some of the severe weather systems that we may be facing in some islands like Grand Bahama, like Abaco, where a lot of our mangroves are dying or dead. And we didn't pay attention. A girlfriend and I were talking, actually the director of education, and we were sharing with some friends the other day and talking about what would have happened. We can't say for sure, but what would have happened if after Wilma and after Hurricane Jane, if we had understood the importance of the mangroves and immediately started replanting. We cannot undo, but would the Dorian situation have been a different outcome if we had embraced this? And so Dr. Delaveau did such an incredible job in sharing the importance of the mangrove forest, the diverse ecosystems, and the fact that we must keep these systems alive. If you missed those 2 episodes, it's a must rehab. You've got to go on our YouTube channel at BNRF Bahamas, and the videos are there. You can get yourself up to speed to where we are in the series. And so tonight it's episode 3 of 4 episodes. We're going to do the final in this first sector on December 13th. So we ask you to look out for that. But tonight we're going to be talking about who we are as a nation, who we are as a people. Now, I'm going to ask you this question and give me some feedback in the chat. When we talk about the Bahamas as, we talk about our islands. I said I'm in Grand Bahama. We have Miss Hardy, she's in Abaco. We have Talisha, she's in Central Andros. We refer to our islands as the family islands or the out islands. Remember when they used to be called the out islands? The out islands. Immediately, what's the connotation that comes to mind? What comes to mind when you hear that? The out islands, the family islands. As a Nasuvian coming to Grand Bahama, the lens that by which we look at and where we see things is so different when you immerse yourself in an environment. Everything is so Nassau-centric until you get to live in these communities. How would it frame? What would be the context if we saw ourselves as who we actually are, an ocean nation? Just saying that shifts the atmosphere. And so tonight we're going to get into a conversation. We are an ocean nation, our ocean economy and fisheries. It is who we are. We want you to engage with us as we have this. The purpose of these series is to educate. It is to empower. And then we want you to go out and we need you to share. We need you to explain to others. We need you to explore the space. We need you to agitate because we want to bring about change in our conversation, in our environment, in our communities through these critical conversations. So tonight we actually have with us Dr. Dahlgren, who is going to be sharing a little bit on where we are as an ocean nation. But we want you to think about that. We want you to factor, if we saw ourselves as an actual ocean nation, how would that frame our very interactions? I have some talking points. Our landmass is about 5,300 square miles, and it spreads over 90,000 square miles of ocean in the southern portion of the North Atlantic. That means that we have more ocean than we have land. We have more ocean than we have land. What are we doing with it? How are we utilizing this to really propel us into 21st, 22nd century living? Science Direct in an article stated that the Bahama Islands are dependent on their seas to maintain GDP of US 2.7 billion through tourism and the harvest of marine resources. How much can we benefit from our oceans? The waters that are all around us. What if we reframed our thinking? 2/3 of the earth is covered by water. As we saw in the clips that introduced us to this conversation this evening, more flats, more blue holes, some of the richest aragonite, carbonite that exists in the Bahamas. And we're waiting for others to come and exploit. And we're standing around passively. Tonight, we're asking you to engage. Listen attentively as Dr. Craig comes on and shares with us this evening. And as you listen, we want you to take your notes, drop your questions in the chat, explore where we're going, what we are doing, how we as the Bahamas can move from where we are to where we need to be using the resources that we actually have in our hand. We're going to go to a short video clip. And after the video clip, I will come right back and we're going to introduce our guest speaker and get right into our conversation because we want to maximize our time with him. And we want you to take your notes, write the notes in the chat. We're going to be watching the chat because we do want to leave a little bit of time at the end for some Q&A. We'll be right back.
Described as a tiny, fragile ball of life hanging in the void, the Earth has held captive the heart and imagination of humanity for countless centuries by its vast, mysterious complexity and splendor. Nestled neatly in the bosom of the Americas is an impressive array of islands known as the Caribbean. In the northern quadrant of these islands, we find a robust system of aquatic and terrestrial harmony, home to the largest coral reef and mangrove nursery system in the Caribbean and the Western world. I give you the Bahamas. With its unique composition of limestone rock, the exploration of the Bahama Islands has revealed an amazing world of natural resources that can be found on any number of its 700 islands and 2,300 rocks and keys. The Bahamas also hosts several of the world's titles, ranging from the third largest barrier reef to the greatest concentration of blue holes, flats, and bonefish population, among many others. Each resource displays incredible features and functionality that support the existence of hundreds of the Earth's marine and wildlife species. It is of highest priority that we sensitize our fellow Bahamian citizens and visitors alike to bolster a culture of conservation and to cultivate a sustainable future for these most precious and finite resources.
So sharing tonight on the Bahamas and Ocean Nation, Dr. Craig Dahlgren. He's a marine ecologist with the Perry Institute for Marine Science here in the Bahamas. He studied a wide range of topics related to tropical marine ecosystems. His work includes studies of mangrove and coral reef ecosystem, efficacy of marine protected areas, and population dynamics of fisheries species ranging from traditional Caribbean fishery species like the Nassau grouper and the Caribbean spiny lobster to emerging fisheries like sea cucumbers, parrotfish, and gongoneerans. I hope I pronounced that correctly. This work has led to dozens of peer-reviewed publications and has influenced marine resources management and policy in the Bahamas, Mesoamerican Reef, and throughout the Caribbean region. At present, his work is focused on improving management of and expanding the network of marine protected areas in the Bahamas and elsewhere, the restoration of coral reef and mangrove ecosystems, and improved fisheries management for traditional and emerging fisheries species in the Bahamas and elsewhere. Let us open our minds and our hearts to our guest speaker this evening, Dr. Dahlgren.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I really appreciate being here tonight and getting to talk to you. And what I'm going to try to do is talk a little bit about marine fisheries in the Bahamas and more broadly about the blue economy in general. So why these marine resources are valuable, how they're currently being managed, and really try to pose some questions about how they could be managed better moving into the future. I will say that two things. One is I am a marine ecologist, not an economist. So I am definitely biased more towards the understanding of the natural history of things versus the economic value or socioeconomic importance of some things. And the other thing too is I'm not Bahamian, and I'm not going to come in here pretending I have answers. What I will do though is present some of the data that we've learned and pose some questions that need to be part of a broader conversation among Bahamians about how these resources should be managed. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you. And get started here. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Great. All right. Let me just minimize this. Okay. So the Bahamas really is, like in the introduction, an ocean nation. It has by far more ocean area than land area. It has more coral reefs than any other country or territory in the Caribbean region, more mangroves, more seagrass beds. So these key habitats and ecosystems are of vital importance on a global level, actually, regional and global, not just for the Bahamas. The Bahamas has been blessed with the opportunity to have these of how to manage them for the benefit of people. Sorry, I'm just having a little difficulty here. Okay. A lot of what I'm going to be talking about is based on looking at fisheries in the Bahamas. And I just wanted to put this up there for those of you that are scientifically inclined. This is a review paper that I was part of with my colleague, Krista Sherman, back in 2018 that reviews a lot of what I'm going to talk about today. So I just wanted to put this up as a reference for those of you interested in looking into this a bit deeper than what I'm going to talk about today. So first, let me get started just talking about fisheries management in general. And the reason why I'm focused on fisheries here when we talk about the ocean economy is traditionally the ocean economy has been fisheries. They've been synonymous for centuries. And there's several different ways to look at fisheries management. From the fisher's perspective, they're trying to maximize their catch and profits. And for centuries, that's been the goal of fisheries management, to try to maximize the landings, maximize profits for fishers. But in many cases, we realize that we do have finite resources, and those resources became overexploited and in some cases driven to the brink of extinction or even to extinction. So fisheries management then pivoted about 100 years ago or so towards looking at sustainability. And in the 1950s, the focus shifted to maximizing sustainable yields or optimizing yields. So they realized that we can't just exploit things indefinitely. We do have some natural boundaries that we need to stay within, imposed on us by the biology and ecology of the species that we're relying on. And that made some improvements, but still we've had problems with fisheries management. And more recently, within the past 20 to 30 years, we see more of ecosystem-based fisheries management. So not just looking at each individual species and how to optimize their yield for the benefit of people, but looking at ecosystems as a whole, how those fishery species fit into those ecosystems, and how we can sustain that ecosystem and derive all the benefits that that ecosystem provides, not just fisheries, but also some of the other ecosystem services, looking at coastal protection or carbon sequestration or the value for tourism, and how fisheries and other exploitive activities fit into that management scheme. So the challenges of doing this are based on two different things. One is the biology and ecology of the species that are being harvested. That requires some amount of data. We need to have information on those species to know how to manage them. The management of one species may be very different from that of another species or group of species. So we have to tailor how we manage these things based on that information. And then also characteristics of the ecosystem and the habitat in which they live. So that's one set of challenges. The other set of challenges is related to, we're really not managing the fish, we're managing people and how they use the fish. So we need to realize that any action that's taken to manage the fishery is going to affect the livelihoods and food security of people. Whether it's a small fisherman just fishing for their family, or a large fishing fleet that's fishing for export, it will have those kind of real impacts on people. Another factor is compliance. We want to have people complying with whatever the management actions are. A lot of people refer to this as enforcement. I look at enforcement not as an objective of itself, but really just a tool that we can use to build compliance. And then also there's international considerations. A lot of the resources that we're talking about are not uniquely Bahamian. They're shared across different islands. And I'll talk about that in a couple minutes and how that could work. So again, thinking about these complexities in the Bahamas, where you have such a big marine area and very complex one, where you have reefs. It's not just one island surrounded by reefs with some mangroves. It's 700 islands and thousands of smaller keys. It's hundreds of thousands of acres of seagrass beds. It's over 5,300 square kilometers of coral reefs spread out over a large area. So it becomes very complex, and the population spread out. And what might be something that's suitable for high dense population in Nassau might be very different than nearby on Andros, where population densities are much lower. So we need to take those considerations into effect. The other thing is just the biology of species. And this is just using a silly example with this little bicolor damselfish that's not a fishery species, but this is pretty much the life cycle that most marine organisms have, where they'll spawn and release eggs. Either they'll lay them on the seafloor or spawn directly into the water and they'll get carried around, but they hatch into larvae. And these larvae develop over a period of time in the water, where they can swim to some extent, but largely are being carried around by ocean currents. They'll develop for a period of time that may be hours, it may be months. And I'll talk about some examples and how that differs, until they reach a stage where they are able to swim. They'll select where they go to. They'll select their environment based on its chemical sense, its sounds, what they see for a refuge. And then they'll develop as juveniles. And those juveniles might live in parts of the marine environment that are very different from the adults. So they might migrate as they grow. Now, those larvae are important, and this gets into some of the international considerations and some of the complexities as well from the biological point of view. This is just a quick run through of 3 months in 2013 of the ocean currents of the Bahamas that we've modeled. And you can see that it's incredibly complex. There's eddies and gyres that break, causing current patterns to differ. Those larvae that are spawned, say, on, I can't find my cursor here, on San Salvador, might end up being transported to Abaco. They might get caught in a gyre and get brought over to Cat Island, might get entrained in Exuma Sound. It's all very variable. The other thing is that larvae that are reaching the Bahamas during this period of time, a lot of them might be coming from Cuba or other parts of the region on one of these currents that are flowing up from the south. So it's a very complex system, and what we're managing for in the Bahamas might be then carried off to somewhere else as larvae. So we're really dealing with the population we have of different fishery species in the Bahamas, but they might be part of a bigger whole where we're exporting those as larvae to other places or bringing them in from other places. So the management in the Bahamas depends to some extent on how these resources are managed in other places as well. And then, like I mentioned, a lot of these species have these complex life cycles where they'll settle in out of the plankton into seagrass beds or mangroves, and then move out onto the reefs only as they grow. So if you're managing, say, for something like this barracuda, you really need to take into account more than just the characteristics of the adult barracuda and where it lives, but you also have to take into characteristics of the barracuda when it's young, when it's a baby, basically, where it might be living in the mangroves or in seagrass beds, and how it then might migrate to mangroves and then onto reefs as adult. All these systems are connected. So management, this ecosystem-based management approach is attempting to bring in all those things as a whole, not just managing for the barracuda, but for every place the barracuda lives, the prey that it feeds on in those places, and the things that might feed on it in those places as well. So how do we do this? There's 5 basically different ways to manage fisheries, 5 different strategies. And I'll get to the Bahamas examples in a few minutes, but really what we're looking at there's restrictions on how much catch is allowed. So things like a total allowable catch or quotas are examples of that. The government is telling fishermen how much they're allowed to take. Now, a lot of this needs to be based on very detailed scientific information that in a country like the Bahamas or other small island developing states may not be available. So that's a difficult thing to do. There's other things like entry restrictions where there's a certain number of tags that are issued that fishermen have. And if you don't have one, you don't get to fish for a species. If you do have it, you are able to fish for a limited time, or licenses, or in an area, the amount of the landings get divided up among several different fishermen. So there's restrictions to entry into the fishery. There's gear restrictions, banning traps or allowing traps, using scuba gear to spear fish, allowing certain kinds of netting for different species. Those are all examples of gear restrictions. And a lot of times the restrictions are put in place to make sure the fishermen are not able to use the most efficient gear for catching the fish, the most effective stuff, but something that's suboptimal to allow some fish to escape, and also reduce the amount of bycatch, say, unintended catch. There's spatial management, like marine protected areas, marine fishery reserves, national parks, things like that. And then there's closed seasons. So examples that we have in the Bahamas are like closed spawning seasons for grouper or for crawfish. And there might be hybrids between these, a closed area that's only closed during spawning season, say, or something like that. So there can be multiple things used at a time. Well, here in the Bahamas, all of the fisheries regulations are really based in the Fisheries Act, but there's other legislation for spatial management, like the Bahamas National Trust Act for establishing marine national parks. And basically, the tools that the Bahamas is using to manage the fisheries are restrictions on the type of gear that can be used, spatial management like national parks and fishery reserves, permits and licenses for sport fishing that set maximum allowable catches of certain species. Again, that's only for sport fishing. And then there's some species-specific management that goes on. There's a number of protected species that you're not allowed to fish for. Right now, it's turtles, sharks. You're not allowed to commercially fish for bonefish. And then there's species-specific management for conch, crawfish, grouper and rockfish, bonefish, stone crab, and sponges. And what I'll do is go into some examples. The one thing I do want to point out here, though, is that if you see a species that's not, or think of a species that's not listed here, margate fish, other grunts, snapper, muttonfish, hogfish, parrotfish, those are entirely unmanaged in the Bahamas right now. Really, these species listed are only the ones that are being managed. And that hasn't been an issue necessarily in the past, but as the fishery sector grows, it could become an issue. So let's just talk about some of these species as examples and see how they're managed in the Bahamas. The first that I'll bring up is lobster. By far the most important fishery species in the Bahamas. Lobsters account for about 35%, I think, of the value of Bahamian exports, which in 2019 was almost $230 million for that year. And 13% of all the imported spiny lobster from the Caribbean region into the US comes from the Bahamas. So the fishery is huge. It's by far the most valuable one. The key factors in managing this fisheries from the science side of things is that lobsters have a pretty unique life cycle, unique to crustaceans, where the male will deposit a spermatophore. It looks like a black tar spot on the belly of a female, or the chest region of a female. And the female then broods her eggs under her tail and will scrape off that spermatophore and use that to fertilize the eggs. And she'll produce multiple clutches of eggs each year that she'll brood until they hatch out to larvae, and then they get carried around by the currents. Those larvae will develop for 90 days to 12 months until they become this, what's known as a PL, or puerulus larvae, post larvae. That can actually, looks like a transparent version of a big lobster, and it can swim. And it swims to inshore nursery areas that are usually dominated by a seaweed called Laurencia, usually found within mangrove creeks or enclosed sounds, that sort of area. And as they grow, they'll move out onto reefs. They mature in about 3 years, or when they're carapace, the distance between their eyes and the start of their tail is about 3.5 inches. The way the fisheries manage right now is there's about 4 main regulations. There's a minimum size. The tail length has to be 5.5 inches, which corresponds with the size at which they begin to reach maturity. The closed season encompasses from April 1st to July 31st, encompasses when they're most reproductively active. They do spawn at different times in different places a little bit, though. And that rule, to be honest with you, was put in place to coincide with the Florida closed lobster season, so that fishers from Florida early on wouldn't come across to the Bahamas and fish in the Bahamas when they couldn't fish in Florida. Can be done on catching a lobster, killing it before you actually have a chance to look at what the eggs are. And then finally, compressors can't be used. So there's a gear restriction. Compressors can't be used from 30 to 60 feet. So, or can only be used from 30 to 60 feet, sorry. So is this fishery well managed? Well, there's mixed feelings about this. The Marine Stewardship Council, MSC, certified this fishery as being sustainable, the only sustainable spiny lobster fishery that is certified in the world. If you look at landings data, the landings haven't dropped off. They measure total catch and catch per unit effort. So the amount that is caught by a single vessel per day or single fisher per day, and that hasn't dropped. So there are some signs that it is a sustainable fishery. On the other hand, there's some evidence that it might not be from an ecosystem level. What we're seeing is that over time, the fishery has changed from being one maybe 100 years ago where it was people going out spearing lobsters they found on the reef, to one where people were putting a lot of traps in near the reef, baited traps to attract the lobsters, to one where people are now using condos, basically putting in artificial habitats away from the reef. And what we're seeing is that by using condos, they may be concentrating lobsters around those condos. Spiny lobsters are very social animals. They'll be aggregated together by nature. So when one finds a good condo to live in, it'll attract its friends. But they may be caught before they can make it to a reef. And what we're seeing is on reefs in our fishery independent surveys, we're not relying on catch statistics. We're actually going in the water and looking. We've seen over the past 20 to 30 years, a decrease in spiny lobsters on the reefs. And we may be losing something from the ecosystem perspective, some critical services they provide to maintaining coral reef and seagrass health because of that. So that's just something to think about there. But from the sustainability perspective, the fishery does appear to be sustainable right now. If we look at another one, Nassau grouper, it's not as important as spiny lobsters in terms of its value. It's not a major export species. It's actually a critically endangered species, considered that by the IUCN's Red List of Endangered Species, which makes it a more of a challenge to manage. The Bahamas is one of the few places left where there's actually populations that can support a fishery. But it still accounts for about $1 million a year in export. Some of the key biological, sorry about my typo there, biological considerations are, it makes mass migrations to spawning aggregation. So many fish, it lives in a very narrow home range, only a couple hundred meters on a reef as an adult. But for about 2 weeks a year, they'll migrate up to a couple hundred miles. So fish from northern Exuma Keys, we've tracked all the way down to Long Island, to the southern tip of Long Island, where they go to spawn. So they make these long distance migrations where fish that are normally pretty solitary will aggregate by the hundreds to hundreds of thousands when they spawn. And this picture actually shows a female loaded with eggs in the foreground, and some of these fish with dark on top, light on the bottom, they are Nassau grouper. Those are the males. They change color when they're ready to spawn. When they do spawn, the larvae drift around for about 35 to 50 days, carried by ocean currents. They'll settle into the same sort of habitats that the little lobsters settle into, that seaweed Laurencia in tidal creeks and sounds. And they'll shift out to live on coral reefs as they grow. Over the first 2 or 3 years of their life, they'll be migrating from these inshore nurseries to offshore reef areas. And they reach maturity at about 45 centimeters, but most don't actually migrate to spawn until they're about 54 centimeters. So that's the biology. Here's the management. There's 2 basic management things on this fish. One is a minimum size limit of 3 pounds, which corresponds with that 45 centimeter size that they first reach maturity. And then they also have a closed season from December 1st to February 28th, which corresponds with the peak of their spawning migration time, the spawning season. So then I'll pose the question, is this fishery managed effectively? There are some good things about this fishery. It has survived, whereas fisheries for this species have crashed in other places. But what we've seen is that there's a couple things going on here. This minimum size of 3 pounds is, again, the size that the first individuals start to reach maturity. Ideally, what you'd want to have is have every individual spawn at least once before they're able to be caught. So that would require raising the size limit from about 3 pounds to a 54 centimeter fish, which corresponds with a fish closer to about 9 pounds. So that would be a really big increase in size to make sure that all fish should have the ability to spawn at least once. The closed season is good. It's at the right time. You could argue that maybe starting it a little earlier or going a little later would capture all potential spawning for the year. But this does a pretty decent job. There's not a lot of compliance with that closed season, however. We've seen over the past 10 years since this closed season began to be implemented, and it's been phased in over a period of time, and it wasn't until about 2015 that the closed season became a permanent fixture. We've seen at least one, probably 2 spawning aggregations collapse in that time from illegal fishing. And it's not big boats going in, it's a small boat that can go out and spear 100 fish or trap 100 fish every day for about a week, which is enough to knock down that spawning aggregation to the point where it no longer forms. The other thing is that it's not a fishery management tool per se, but spatial closures, national parks, marine protected areas are effective at protecting Nassau grouper. And we see bigger individuals, higher biomass of fish for Nassau grouper in the Exuma Keys Land and Sea Park, a well protected area, than we do anywhere else in the Bahamas. But because fish leave that park to go spawn and are likely to be caught when they leave the park and go spawn, we've seen the same trajectory in the park as we do elsewhere in terms of a decrease. We just see that it started at a much higher level. So Nassau grouper populations are continuing to decline in spite of these efforts. So more could be done here for this fishery. I'm aware of time here. The last fishery I'll go into in detail is the queen conch. And this one might be the most complicated in a lot of ways. And this picture shows 2 queen conch mating. This pile of what looks like sand in the foreground is actually an egg mass laid by the female that's been fertilized by the male behind her here. And that's critical for the biology of conch. They don't aggregate to spawn the way grouper do. They don't brood their eggs the way lobster do, but conch only move around so much. There needs to be a certain amount of density in the population. There needs to be about 75 conch per hectare. So that a hectare is 100 yards by 100 yards, more or less. You need to have that number of conch in an area to have them find each other and be able to reproduce. Anything lower than that, there's virtually no reproduction. When they do reproduce, eggs here will hatch and the larvae are floating around in the water for 3 to 4 weeks. They'll settle into sand, and within 3 to 5 years, they'll mature. When they're mature, they have this well-developed flared lip of the shell that's about the size of a Bahamian penny thick. It's 1.5 centimeters thick. They reproduce in the summer primarily, and they live 20 years or more. So that's the biology. How's the fishery managed? Well, there's one real big fishery management measure, and that's having that flared lip. But again, the recent biology is showing that it's not good enough to just have that lip grow to the point where it flares out. That's when they start to mature. Most individuals are not mature until that lip thickens to 15 millimeters or 1.5 centimeters. Other measures that are being considered is a ban on exports of conch. Well, that's definitely will reduce harvest of conch to some extent. And the reason why we're concerned about this is we have strong evidence that conch populations in the past 30 years or so have decreased anywhere from 60 to 90% around the Bahamas. That export ban may help a little bit, but what we really don't even know is what percentage of the total conch harvest is exported. We have good figures on how much is exported, but we don't have good numbers on how much is harvested for domestic consumption. Another thing being considered is a closed season. Well, they do reproduce in the summer like lobster do, and we have closed seasons for lobster and grouper. Well, why not for conch? Well, it may make some sense to have a closed season for conch while they're in their most active reproductive period. But the difference is that lobster brood their eggs, remember? So if you catch a female lobster during that spawning time, she's likely to have a clutch of eggs of tens of thousands of babies that she's holding on to before releasing them. Or if you catch a grouper during that closed season before it has a chance to spawn, where all those fish are going to spawn together, really the closed seasons to prevent those spawning aggregations from being wiped out, because they can get wiped out easily. So by setting up a closed season for a fish that aggregates to spawn at a specific time, you can preserve the population really well. Conch are spawning all over the place. It might not have the same benefits to close the season as it does for these other species. What might be more effective is to have more protected areas. Some of the few places where we see conch densities at that level where they can reproduce are in national parks like the Exuma Keyslands and Sea Park. So creating more of these protected areas where we can have a high density of individuals spawning, the larvae then get transported out of those areas, settle into places where fishermen can fish for them. You might have a sustainable feedback loop there where fishermen can harvest outside of the protected areas if there's enough protected areas preserving enough conch to supply those areas, if that makes sense. A couple other things I just want to touch on, again, realizing time constraints here. The next is unregulated fisheries. So like I indicated before, a lot of the species that are harvested have no restrictions or anything other than basic gear restrictions. You can't use a spear gun, you can't use scuba, things like that. All the fish that you see in this picture are unregulated species in the Bahamas. And some of them, like parrotfish, play critical ecosystem roles. Parrotfish are some of the main grazers of seaweed on reefs. If you have too much seaweed on reefs, it'll outcompete coral, it'll smother the coral, overgrow the coral, and that will shift the whole balance of the ecosystem away from being a coral reef to an algae reef. Corals are under threat from a number of different things, from climate change to disease to coastal development. Parrotfish are one of the few things that gives coral a chance to recover from those impacts. And they're being harvested now. It's maybe not a traditional Bahamian fishery species, but we've done some studies interviewing fishers, and the vast majority of Bahamian fishers report catching parrotfish, especially from some islands. There's other emerging species that we wouldn't consider fishery species per se, but they're aquatic species that are harvested, like this sea feather here, this gorgonian, Antilogorgia elizabethae is the scientific name. That's not important. But what is important is that a lot of these sorts of sea fans, sea plumes, things like that, have chemical compounds that provide defense so that they don't get eaten. Those same chemicals that they have that keep them from getting eaten by fish and other things have other bioactive properties that pharmaceutical companies, drug companies, cosmetic companies are then using to make products out of. So what we're seeing is that there's a shift to harvesting these non-traditional species that may have some value. And one of the challenges is allowing that exploration, allowing that harvest, but making sure the Bahamas receives benefits from that harvest, from the use of those chemical compounds and those things. The Bahamas should be receiving some kind of royalties or something from natural products that are exploited in its own waters for this kind of use. And that's the root of one of the recent legislative acts passed earlier this year. The Access and Benefit Sharing and Traditional Knowledge Act was related to things like this. And this species actually provides a good example. This is one that is being used for compounds that have anti-inflammatory properties that are then used by extracted from the animal and used by Estee Lauder to put in anti-wrinkle creams, things like that. And they have been providing royalties back to the Bahamas. And then thinking for the last couple minutes about our ocean economy in general, we need to begin thinking beyond fisheries. There's a lot of ecosystem services that marine habitats provide, like coral reefs, mangroves, and seagrass beds. They do support fisheries, but they also support tourism, provide coastal protection, and also are very important in sequestering carbon. They're taking CO2 out of the atmosphere and binding it up and burying it, basically, to reduce the effect of greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide. That's a place where the Bahamas can really capitalize. The Bahamas has some of the largest mangrove areas in the region and seagrass areas in the region. And those are two types of plants that really can sequester a lot of carbon, bury it in their roots. And there are now markets for carbon. So that's something that the Bahamas can begin to look into as far as a new source of revenues from its marine resources. And right now we see that between the fisheries value and potential carbon sequestration values, seagrasses have been valued by economists. And this is by Venetia Hargraves Allen, who does a lot of work in the Bahamas. Bahamian seagrass beds valued at up to almost $160,000 per square kilometer per year. Mangroves, an order of magnitude higher than that, $1.25 million per square kilometer per year as a nursery habitat, and also, again, sequestering carbon and protecting shorelines. And coral reefs are valued at up to $1.35 million per square kilometer per year. So really, in looking at all of the Bahamas, coral reefs have a lot of value on a per unit area basis, but their area is much smaller than some of these other things. So mangroves and seagrass beds may have equal or greater value as a whole to the Bahamas than coral reefs even, which was remarkable to me to find out. And then thinking again beyond just the ecosystem services these things provide, there's been a big push, and this is from the World Bank, this graphic, to develop blue economies, sustainable economies based on the ocean. And that can include things like renewable energy, things that are already going on like fisheries and tourism, things that we encompassed in looking at ecosystem valuation like climate change, but also maritime transport and waste management, all done in a sustainable way. The Bahamas has received several grants to develop different things with blue economy. We later on this week actually are doing our final proposal to the Inter-America Development Bank to establish a ecosystem restoration-based tourism model for the Bahamas, where visitors can come in and help restore Bahamian coral reefs and mangroves, paying for that restoration through tourism dollars. So the blue economy is really something that's just beginning to be launched or considered, but has a lot of potential for the Bahamas. But there's a lot of threats out there. and I just listed some of them here. The lack of data and monitoring is a big hindrance to getting some of these things started. And for implementation, we need to have that scientific information. And coming from me as a scientist, you shouldn't be surprised that I put that on top of the list. It might not be the most important thing, but it is something that we can address and should address moving forward. Another issue is lack of compliance, particularly with fisheries. Making sure that people are complying with the laws and regulations is critical for sustaining those fisheries. Illegal and unreported fishing. So this can be anything from local illegal fishing to the fact that we don't have any reporting mechanism for fisheries in many of the family islands, to things like having foreigners come in, whether they're coming from the north or south, and poaching in Bahamian waters. Coastal development and increasing demand for marine resources associated with coastal development is potentially a threat. I wouldn't say coastal development, it has to be inconsistent with developing a healthy blue economy. It needs to be part of it. Oil drilling can be a threat to the blue economy. That's without question. Other emerging things like diseases like stony coral tissue loss disease, which we first found in the Bahamas in 2019, is devastating reefs around Grand Bahama, Nassau, and a few other places. If we don't bring some of these diseases and invasive species issues in check, the ecosystems are going to be very damaged and very different from what they are now. Much lower diversity, much lower value, much fewer ecosystem services provided. So things like stony coral tissue loss disease and climate change need to get brought under control, and we need to adapt to it. And I will stop sharing there and can take any questions.
Wow, that was rich. That was all encompassing. You've given us quite a lot to dive into, and so I do have a couple of questions,
Sure.
but I need to anchor something. So the blue economy and the presentation that you've made, has this been elevated to a governmental level to the point that it can be used as a factor to address some of the economic challenges, i.e. debt and unemployment? Because there seems to be incredible opportunities that are right on the table for even diversifying education and learning. How has this been elevated? Because a lot of what you shared, I've not heard before.
Yeah, it has been elevated to the government in some levels in a piecemeal fashion. There hasn't been a strategic blue economy plan developed for the Bahamas that I'm aware of per se. But different pieces of the blue economy have been elevated to the Bahamas, whether it's through the Nature Conservancy or through Department of Marine Resources doing their own research. There's been a lot of interest in carbon credits and things like that for mangroves and potentially for seagrass, although that hasn't been done anywhere in the world yet, but the Bahamas could be the ideal place to start that.
Yes, because like you said, there've been snatches, a little talking bite here and carbon print, here, and then the blue economy. So we're using these cliche words, but what do we need to do? This is an incredible start. What we want to talk about, a solution-driven, action-oriented, steps from here. So what can we do to move the conversation cohesively so that it can be elevated, one, because we need the awareness, we need the education, and then two, it can be actioned so that something tangible can result from this mammoth amount of information that you shared.
Yeah, I think that what needs to probably happen would be to bring people with technical expertise like myself, economists and others together with different government agencies represented and different stakeholders in the Bahamian economy all represented together, and really come up with some actionable items, because a lot of the scientific expertise isn't necessarily, it's going to provide the basic ingredients, but it's not going to get things to the point where there's actionable agenda put in place that is going to be something that is supported by government, supported by the Bahamian people, and that's going to work for everybody. So it needs to have all of those voices coming together in a cohesive fashion. I think through a series of workshops, maybe it could be done within the next year or so, if somebody was so inclined to organize that.
Okay, awesome. We're taking notes, and I'm going to go to the chat. So one other question. From your perspective as an expert, and based on where we are as a country, and the immediate needs, immediate demands, what would you say, how would you prioritize, let's say the top three areas of focus, if we want to, one, maximize this, where we are, and take these resources, see what can give us the immediate impact? What would you say are the top three priorities that we could look at from everything you've presented here?
That's a good question. I think, and this is not in order of priority for those top three, climate change is the biggest existential threat to many marine ecosystems and many countries like the Bahamas for a number of reasons. So climate change has to be, dealing with climate change has to be up there on that list. Mostly in terms of adaptation to climate change, how the Bahamas is going to adapt, because shifting Bahamas energy resources is not going to make a huge impact on the global climate projections. So adaptation to climate change, I think the effect, well, the stony coral tissue loss disease that I just kind of mentioned in passing is another one that is going to devastate reefs in the Bahamas unless it's brought in check. So investing in research and action to preventing the spread of that disease. And then the third thing I think would be related to marine protected areas. And right, well, before 2021, about 11% of the Bahamian territorial waters were in marine protected areas. About, well, after July, when new ones got designated, that went to somewhere around 18%, I think. But in terms of effective management and enforcement, is probably only about 1%. So we already have these areas that could be vital tools to support any one of a number of the fisheries related issues I brought to, and protecting ecosystems, and it's not being utilized effectively. So better management of those areas, I think, is one of the next steps also that could have a major impact moving forward.
Awesome. So we have some questions, and I'm sure a lot of those things are definitely impacted by economics. I mean, it's all about the money. Yeah. Is the money coming in? So there's a question that has to do with the Estee Lauder cosmetic that you mentioned. Do we know how much revenue is received from that, from the royalties of that? And also, if a group wanted to get involved in supplying aquatic materials to cosmetics and pharmaceutical companies, is there any legislation or policy or protocols that governs how to get involved with that? Yeah,
so in the first part, there is information on how much has been harvested, how much revenues it's brought in for fisheries, and how much has been paid in royalties. We just developed Dr. Sherman and myself just developed a management plan for that for the government. I don't have those numbers off the top of my head right now, but they do exist. And if somebody wants to follow up with me, I can provide that information from that draft management plan that's awaiting approval in government. Okay. As far as getting involved in that, there is, this past year, a new law, the Access and Benefit Sharing and Traditional Knowledge Act, which governs all collection of samples for or use of marine resources for non-consumptive, not non-fisheries related things. So there is a framework to apply for a permit to be collecting or sampling. With respect to that gorgonian, that soft coral that was being harvested for ultimate use in Estee Lauder, the Department of Marine Resources issued a permit to just a handful of fishermen that had so it was a very limited entry fishery, and there was only so many involved, and I think they, revenues were on the order of $300,000 to $400,000 per year for that particular fishery. But there are potentially other ones out there. It's just very difficult with the new legislation to. There's a lot of hoops to jump through, put it that way, to get to it.
I would think so. And so this brings us to one of the first questions that came. The person's trained, because this now seems to be a very specific environment, a very specific set, now new industry. How do we get people trained to even enforce these management tools that you're talking about? Because if one, we don't know about it, we don't know the policies, so you don't know what the requirements and compliance requirements are. How do you get people trained to move about? What are we doing in that arena?
Yeah, there have been efforts that we've been involved with, Bahamas National Trust, Brief, and other organizations in the Bahamas to train non-scientists in assessments, to train RBDF and police force and customs officials in what to look for as far as enforcement of regulations for import, export, that sort of thing. There's a lot of human capacity building that needs to still take place, though.
Yeah, that's sadly evident.
Yeah.
So
and the other thing, just to add to that a little bit, is it also needs to be prioritized too a little bit by government. There's obviously priorities for enforcement officials on drug intervention and immigration, things like that. Bahamian fisheries need to be up there on that level for them to really pay attention.
I just was going to ask, is there an awareness or an appreciation of how critical this is, and that we perhaps could be entering some crisis zones if we don't address it? Do you get that sense from, and when we say government, it's whoever is in, I mean, whatever,
right,
just governing, do you get the sense that there is an actual appreciation for the elements, for the environment, and where we are with our ocean economy?
Yes and no, I guess is the real answer. I do get it from some of the technical staff, but maybe some of the higher ups that are juggling many different competing priorities aren't necessarily seeing that, stony coral tissue loss disease is a wildfire coming through and wiping out reefs or things like that. We're just we need to do a better job of raising awareness and educating a broader stakeholder base to really get the word out. So it's really incumbent upon us to make them realize that this is an issue.
Awesome. We have another question. It has to do with the conch population. So what can we do to have the conch harvesting policed in order to preserve future conch? I mean, Bahamians love a bar conch, and that seems to be something like one of the lower lying that a wider set of stakeholders, i.e. our communities, can get involved in. What can we do?
Yeah. And conch is one of those that should be able to be managed. I think the biggest thing, well, two things. One are that we do know that marine protected areas are working for conch when they're enforced. So more of that, but that's not an everyday Bahamian person what they can do. I think the biggest thing is to realize that those little conch that have a very thin lip of the shell that doesn't flare out, those are immature conch, and those need to get left to grow. That's probably the biggest thing. If we look at piles of conch shells or middens that get piled up near landing sites. If you go back to the 20, 30, 40 years down, it was mostly mature adult conch, and over time it shifted to some of the immature ones. And really going back to only harvesting the mature ones, it might take a while. It might make it harder to get conch in the short term, which I understand is a problem for many people. But if that were followed, then 10, 20 years from now, we would have healthier conch populations that could be more sustainable.
Have you identified some areas that may be conducive to becoming protective zones for the conch environment?
Specifically for conch, yeah. And some of them actually have been designated as some form of marine protected area. East Grand Bahama, West Grand Bahama, for example, are two of the biggest conch areas. But also in Exuma Sound and the Schooner Keys around off of Cape Eleuthera, places in South Andros. There are around the country, the Berry Islands, places where we know there's great nursery habitat for conch. It used to support big adult populations, and is still suitable environment for them now. So if we leave those areas alone or protect some of those areas within those places, they could rebound. And it probably wouldn't take more than 5-6 years before seeing very significant results doing that.
Awesome. And so we have another question. Why aren't our fish markets being monitored or inspected based on the standards that you're sharing with us this evening?
So all the exporters are monitored very well by the Department of Marine Resources. And some of the fish markets, around Montague or Potter's Key are okay. It's when you get to the Family Islands where their fish markets are more decentralized, that it becomes just a manpower issue. There's not enough people out there to do the monitoring and to see what's being caught.
Okay. So is there, once we have identified these markets, right? Do we go into them, or do you know of any agency that goes into the markets to provide this kind of education that you're giving us now? Because I mean, sometimes we just assume that somebody grew up, my father was a fisherman, I'm a fisherman, you throw over a line, you know how to fish, but we may not have the foundational backgrounds, this knowledge that teaches us how to do it effectively. Is that happening? Is there any opportunity for it to happen?
No, I think there is opportunity for it to happen, and can happen more effectively than is being done now. I think that there are some decent efforts by the government, by Department of Marine Resources, to reach out to some fishing communities to provide this kind of information and education, and other organizations like BREEF and the Nature Conservancy and Bahamas National Trust have been doing it to an extent. It's definitely probably made some amount of difference, but definitely hasn't solved the problem yet. So we need to innovate, I think, and to see how best to reach the target audience that we want to reach is the answer.
Alrighty, so we're winding down, but I would ask you that question: who is that target audience that we're actually looking to reach?
Yeah, no, I think it's, well, the Bahamian fishing community is very diverse, as the Bahamas are. So it's hard to say, one specific target audience, but I do think there can be a better job reaching different sub audiences within that. So reaching a lot of the fishers themselves, a lot of the community leaders, and then the other thing is the general public. I think that we do work within a capitalist economy where supply and demand plays a role. And if people are not buying grouper during the close season, I've had fishermen tell me this: if nobody's buying fish, we're not fishing for them. So if people are not buying grouper during the close season, they won't be fishing for them during the close season. So I think, there's a role for everybody to play in this. It's not just, the fishers are not the bad guys. They're just doing their job. It's a matter of a little bit of education and disincentivizing them from doing things that are harmful to their resources.
Awesome. So we have persons on right now, and we are a believer in each one reach one. So your takeaway to us this evening, because we're absorbing what you're saying, and I think it really has not only sensitized us, it has prompted many of us. Okay, we've got to up our engagement in this aspect of it, because one, there is opportunity, but one thing we seem not to have as a people is the discipline to take us from here to there. We kind of want it now, and so we don't see the money now, and so we don't see the value in perhaps curbing some of our behavior. What can you share with this group right now? If you do this, if you do that, it will help us or contribute to, some kind of solution. What would those takeaways for us be this evening?
Yeah. And I do think that, especially now when the economy's been hit so hard by COVID and in some places hurricanes, more and more people are relying on the sea for just to feed themselves, let alone bring in income. So that has to happen. I think what we can do though is be the educators to the communities that we live in, and really let people know why it might not be a good idea to take that small conch, or why it might not be a good idea starting later on this week to go fishing for Nassau grouper. Those sorts of things. I think we can all be ambassadors for the ocean, and really try to get the message out. If we all reach one person and have them reach another person, I think that will get us quite a long distance to having everybody at least have some understanding of the issues and can make their own decisions about what's in the best interest for themselves and their communities.
Well, I think you said something earlier, and Clifford Bowes, he's saying the same thing, what's the best way to reach the target audience? You said something earlier about having a strategic plan and a strategic approach. I think sometimes we become interpretive, and so what one person says and one area is shared differently. So I would want to know if you or your institute is open to, I'm sure there are persons here with PTAs, I'm sure there are colleges or schools or communities where this kind of conversation, our members of parliament, the monthly meeting of whatever, town halls, is that something that you're open to, so that the messaging could be cohesive and it's the same messaging that is being shared, as we expand this conversation?
No, we definitely are. And we are aware that we need to do a better job with shaping that message and refining it for the best way to reach the intended audience. And we're just starting to launch a sustainable seafood campaign in 2022 in the Bahamas. And our staff in Nassau, I can put people in touch with them. We would really love to be working with other individuals, organizations throughout the islands to all pull together on this, and in a very partnering way. So we're here to listen as much as we're here to speak, and can really see what might resonate with local communities, because I don't pretend to have all the answers there.
Oh, for sure. Our last question, someone asked how to stop fishing for parrotfish?
So that's a very good question. The answer may be in new legislation that is being considered. Personally, I would rather see things happen from a grassroots level than to be dictated from above. So I think that to build that compliance, people need to understand that these fish are playing important roles for coral reefs. And if they are fished, it's going to not just affect the parrotfish, it'll affect the grouper, it'll affect the lobster, it'll affect the conch, it'll affect everything. So these are one of these keystone species that we need to leave alone. And trying to make that point, I know might be difficult, but I think that kind of education, that word needs to get out, and people again can can make their own decisions on what they think is in the best interest of their families and their communities.
Awesome, awesome. You started out on a point by saying the resources that we thought was infinite is actually finite. And I think because we look out on the ocean and we just see water, we assume that all of the resources underneath just always there, always will be there. And so, there's nothing we can do, but there's so much. Dr. Darwin, thank you so much. You have been a absolute most gracious presenter. It has been an awesome, awesome presentation, a wealth of information. So we just want to say thank you so much for sharing. I know that we will be calling. The partnering, I think you have ignited something with us, and that is something that we certainly will be looking at from a organizational perspective, but I'm sure for us individually, that persons will be reaching out. So before you leave, if you can just drop your email in the chat, or
Yes.
someone that persons can connect with you. If they have follow-up questions, if you can just put that in the chat for us, we'd be most appreciative. And anything else you want to say before you shutting off the mic, go right ahead.
The only other thing I'd like to say is just thank you again for this opportunity. It's my pleasure to do this, and I'm available at any time if somebody does want to email me. I just dropped my email in the chat there.
Awesome. Thank you as well. Thank you. We are most appreciative. So folks, there you have it. These conversations have been indeed critical. A lot of times we, as Bahamians, we contribute to the water cooler conversations just off emotion or what we hear flying about in the marketplace. But these have been experts in our field who are either Bahamians or connected to the Bahamas, and have a vested interest and then have the expertise to share with us exactly where we are, taking that temperature and giving us a myriad of information as to where we can go, just from different perspectives. What could happen if we do nothing? But the potential of if we get involved. And that is what these conversations are about in this series, taking action. We have been for a long, long time, for most of our history, because people call us calm, people say we're a passive nation. And in our passivity, a lot of things are happening, and some of it is to our detriment. This conversation tonight has been vitally important. And I hope, as it has stirred me, that it has stirred you to action. There are a couple things you can do. Firstly, connect perhaps with your own member of parliament, connect with your family, connect with your schools. We need to get the information in, the awareness from even our children. There has to be an appreciation. Bahamian people have to see the value, not just for quote unquote the fisherman, but there's opportunity for those who want to explore this blue economy. There are opportunities for us to build industries, to expand the capacity of our people in terms of skills. If we're looking at this environment, this industry as a viable opportunity. And then there are ways we can partner with other organizations to monetize sustainably some of the things. Who would have thought the seagrass in the Bahamas has the potential to minimize or reduce the carbon footprint and affect our debt? And we can be a part of that. We don't need someone to come and do it for us. And so I'm encouraging all of us to get involved, become active, become contributors to the solutions that our Bahamas need. But there are so many challenges that we have. Yes, we know that. But now we see ways that we can contribute to turning things around. And this is what these conversations have been about. The Bahamas Natural Resources Foundation is a foundation of the people. That includes each and every one of us. If you are not a member, we encourage you, go to our website, go to our Facebook page, sign up to become a member today. When we pool our resources and we give a collective voice to these issues, that voice can resonate with the powers that be and take issues like this from the sidelines into the focus. A lot of times we are very busy putting out fires, but the fire is only in the vicinity and we don't get to see the big picture. Yes, it may take some discipline. It's going to take some time. But if we determine that we are the ones who will be the stopgap to create legacy for our people, then we can start to see some turnarounds in these issues before they become crisis. There's opportunity that we can take some of this flora, take some of what's in our ocean and monetize it in to create industries with cosmetic and pharmaceutical companies. How awesome is that? But again, we need the knowledge. We need to know how to do it sustainably. We need not to go out haphazardly and try to push to get in, but to gain, to increase our awareness of how can we do this in a fair, sustainable manner. This has been an incredible, incredible evening of sharing. We want to thank Dr. Craig Dahlgren for his impartation this evening. Thank you, each and every one of you, for partnering with us, for sharing in this space this evening with us. Go to our YouTube channels, watch the previous ones. Join us on December 13th. We are going to have a panel where we will be discussing the 3 series that have gone before. It promises to be an exciting, engaging evening. You do not want to miss it. And for those of you who did register, we will be sending out a fact sheet on some of the framing, some of the things we want you to process as you come to these conversations. It's not haphazard. It's not a by the way. The critical thinking has a purpose, and we want you to frame who we're talking about. What are some of the challenges? Why do we want to embrace this? Where are these things? Where are these concepts? When should this be happening? How do we make it happen so that it can be much more strategic, much more intentional, very focused as to some of the results that we're looking at. If there are no additional questions, we want to thank you so much for sharing with us this evening. We hope that you have been enlightened. We hope that you have certainly your education and your business, your opportunity to seize business opportunities, your education in this environment, in this space has been expanded. And now we want you to share the information with others, refer them to our YouTube page. More importantly, we want you to come along and partner with us, because we'd like to partner with people like Dr. Craig so that we can make some inroads into this so very vital conversation this evening. Thank you again. Thank you. The name of the website for us is the Bahamas Natural Resources Foundation. You can find all of the series on there, and then we will put the links for all of the speakers so that if you want to, again, you can go to our YouTube channel and watch the previous presentations. They're all there, all of the recordings are there. This one will be uploaded soon after, and you can certainly connect with us or connect directly with Dr. Craig. He left his email address in the chat. For those of you, if you just look up in the chat, it is there. If there are no other questions, we are 3 minutes over, so we want to thank you so much for joining us this evening. Thank you, Dr. Craig, again, and to every single one of you, have a good evening.